Well, welcome to semester 2 of 2021 and our first test seminar. So the first thing I want to do is acknowledge the original custodians of the land, of this land that we're meeting on, the Yurganji people, and pay respects to the ancestors and elders, past, present, and emerging. And I've also been asked to make an announcement about the TESS retreat, which has now been scheduled, written in stone, thanks to Yoko's hard work. It's going to be November 3rd and 4th. So this is a really good opportunity for those of you who are new HDR students, new staff, or people from Townsville. I'm not sure how many are online, to come and to hear about other people's research and to really talk to people, which is something we haven't been able to do a lot of face-to-face for a little bit now. So it's really good to see what other people are up to, share ideas, and develop a esprit de corps really for what's going on in the center. And we usually end up making some decisions about center directions. So you can't have a say in that if you don't show up. So be sure to come along to that. And Yoko, is it at the Pullman again? The Pullman in Palm Cove? Okay, beautiful venue, wonderful lunch. I'll put a plug in for that. And especially people from Townsville, this is a really great opportunity for you to come up and meet colleagues in CANS and a free trip. So anyway, so be sure to come along to that. A lot of work goes into that. So, and I know there'll be a call out to give talks at that as well. So think about that. Anyway, Bill Lawrence, our esteemed director, really, unless you're new, doesn't really need much of an introduction. He's been the director of TESS for some years now. Absolutely amazing CV. Pack it all into one paragraph in the description, like, wow, over 700 papers, several books, et cetera, et cetera. So many awards. And we're really lucky to have him talk today about environmental synergisms. So.
Lori? Great. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Great. It is turned on. Yep, it's turned on. Okay, well, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Lori, for the nice introduction and also for talking about the TESS retreat. That's a pretty big deal every year, and people, quite frankly, really do rave about it. They really do have a fun time at the TESS. That's the theme, is to have a good time and learn and interact and engage and hopefully move ahead. So it's been working pretty well. As Lori mentioned, I'm going to talk about environmental synergisms and the fate of tropical nature. I think we all know what synergisms are. I just kind of wanted to say at the outset, it's easy, I think, sometimes when you're talking about environmental synergisms, you sort of feel like a boxer that's getting pummeled from punches and kicks and other things coming from all directions. And this is sort of what's happening with nature sometimes. And I think it's easy in that kind of situation to go, this is all a disaster and it's hopeless. And I don't think anything's hopeless. I really don't. And so even though we're talking about, I think, some of the biggest environmental potential threats that occur in the future, I really do think that we have to bear in mind that there's good news out there, and there's also an abundance of hope in different ways. But we need to understand what's really going on in order to better attack these environmental perils. Now, we know if we look around the world that we see all kinds of environmental changes happening. Oftentimes, those changes, more than one change, is happening within the same area. So species occurring within a particular area might be subject to multiple environmental insults. And then a key question is, well, what happens if you're getting punched and kicked and slammed all at once? What's the reality of that for nature, for biodiversity? And of course, when we look around the world, I won't say too much about this, but we don't have to look very far to see that there's a lot of scary trends in nature out there. But primarily, what they're doing in many cases is just talking about habitat destruction or deforestation within many of the different areas that they're discussing, but not necessarily looking at all the nuances and other kinds of changes that are happening. So one of the biggest of all the threats, and one I certainly spend quite a lot of time carping about, are roads, because we're living in the most dramatic era of infrastructure expansion in human history, and we are seeing all over the planet just a tsunami of different kinds of dams and roads and hydroelectric projects and coal-fired generating plants and all kinds of other infrastructure, especially in developing nations where about 90% of all new construction is going on right now. And according to the International Energy Agency, we might project to see up to 25 million kilometers of new paved roads by the middle part of this century, which would be enough to encircle the Earth more than 600 times. Now, when I talk about environmental synergisms, I want to be a little bit clear. If you look at the origins of the thinking about environmental synergism, a lot of it goes back to fields like ecotoxicology, where they might, let's say, for instance, have a population of fish, and they might put one potential environmental toxin in there. Maybe that causes 10% mortality, and another environmental toxin in, and that causes 20% mortality of that fish population. But if you put the two of them in at the same time, 10% mortality and 20% mortality, you don't get 30% mortality. You get 70% mortality or something like that. So that's the kind of idea behind environmental synergisms. The technical definition is when you get A and B, the net impact is going to be more than A and B simply added up together. There's a kind of a multiplicative effect. Now, that having been said, if you get too hung up on definitions, you can spend a lot of time chasing your tail and not really getting a lot done. So we actually taken a much more flexible and sort of loose definition, which I started calling the SPLAT hypothesis. And basically, in the idea is that anytime you get two or more environmental drivers and they're either interacting or one of the drivers is facilitating the other, making the other more powerful or more dangerous, then we call that environmental synergism. So the point is simply that we're not getting hung up on terminology. We're not getting hung up on definitions. Multiple environmental drivers oftentimes cause new and disturbing things to happen. When we talked about synergisms, you can see here's a few papers we've done on synergisms. And even though in all those papers, we've always used that loose definition of what an environmental synergism is, we've never had any referees or journal editors give us a hard time about it. So it seems to be okay. So what I'd like to do now is talk about a half dozen synergisms or apparent synergisms that appear to be going on in the tropics. One of them definitely is happening, and that is synergism between roads and hunting. We know that when areas get opened up with roads, this is happening in many parts of the tropics, you get an influx of poachers or subsistence hunters moving into areas. And the lethality of these invaders is oftentimes really increased because they have access to cheap and abundant technology such as automatic rifles, and the cost of a Kalashnikov is not very much in some of these countries, and also wire and cable snares, which are very lethal. You can see here, for instance, here's a chimpanzee. This is a couple of mustache monkeys killed by a hunter in the central Congo. He was trying to sell us those for food. This is a chimpanzee here that's lost its arm to wire snares. And in fact, camera traps are now really starting to reveal a lot of wildlife with snare injuries. For instance, elephants that have had their trunks sheared off. That's quite a common type of damage. Now, here's an example of sort of this interaction between hunting and roads. So here's the Greater Congo Basin, which, as we know, is the second largest tract of tropical forest in the world after the Congo Basin. And if we actually look at the Congo Basin in detail, we see this map. Some of you here would have seen this map before, of the actual roads, major roads within the Congo today. And even if we drill down at higher resolution and look at some of these areas that seemingly don't have roads, but if we use high resolution remote sensing techniques, we see, in fact, a lot of logging roads in these areas that otherwise looked more pristine. So the bottom line is you can see that much of the Congo Basin has really been opened up by roads in a way that can be dangerous for wildlife. Here's an example here on forest elephants that live in the Congo Basin forests. This is the distances away from different roads. So that's 0 kilometers there, and that's up to about 60 kilometers there. As we move further and further away from roads, we get, as we get closer to roads, we get more human signs. So you can see lots of human signs here: hunting caps, rifle shells, machete marks, all kinds of things that would indicate human presence. So those increase a lot near roads. And forest elephants, as we can see here, collapse really as you get closer and closer to roads within the system. And then if you, John Blake and his colleagues modeled this and mapped it out over the existing roads within the Congo Basin. And you can see that what they've come up with there is a map showing usable habitat for forest elephants, given the current network of roads. One thing I should just mention is that study was done in 2007. We've subsequently updated that analysis, not this analysis, but of the maps of the roads, and we found about 100,000 kilometers of new roads in the Congo Basin that have appeared over the last decade or so, okay, about 12 years or so. So bottom line, there's a lot more roads now in the Congo than there were when this analysis was done. You can see, I mean, it gives you a sense of like why people do get concerned about some of these issues. And there's a study done that indicated that forest elephants, that their global population, they only occur in the Congo Basin in West Africa, that their global population collapsed by 2/3 in a recent decade, just in the last like 2005 to 2015. So they're really struggling right now to survive this onslaught of roads and opening everything up and the weapons and other kinds of things that go with it. Okay, now this one, second one here, I'm just going to kind of skip over this, but it's a little complicated. Happy to talk about it to anybody who wants to afterwards. I'm calling it the vegetation breeze. This is an interesting thing that's happening. A lot of people would imagine, if you said to them, this is focusing on the Amazon in this particular instance, if you deforested large areas of forest, or if you fragmented and chopped up the forest, that you would get less evapotranspiration coming up, because it's the vegetation that's giving up all that water vapor and going up and forming rain clouds and rainfall. And that if you cleared some of the forest, you would get less evapotranspiration and less rainfall. What research is actually showing is, believe it or not, in the earlier phases of fragmentation, you actually get more rainfall. Now, what's going on there? I mean, that doesn't even seem to make physical sense. So what's happening? Well, it's this thing called the vegetation breeze. So one thing we could ask is this: if we wanted to hypothesize across the entire Amazon basin what the relationship would be between forest cover, how much forest you've got, and how much rainfall you've got, many people would, and ask them, well, what's the relationship, what's the effect of declining forest cover on rainfall going to be? So the simplest, these are just hypotheticals, examples here. Here's a linear response, so this is something that could happen. Here's a dramatic sort of falling off the cliff response, which is also hypothesized, but the most plausible model is this one here, the one that's closest to fit with the evidence. And what it suggests is this: when you first start clearing the forest, I'm going to jump over here and then I'll jump back. When you first start clearing the forest and fragmenting the forest, what happens is you juxtapose patches of very wet, humid rainforest with patches of dry cropland or cattle pasture. And these are much drier and they have much less humidity coming up off them, and so they don't get the evaporative cooling. So you get this juxtaposition. You've got this pasture, it's hot, it's dry. The air, the hot, warm air dry, is lower density and it tends to rise. And as it rises, you can see it's dragging in the moist air from over the forest. So it's sucking that moist air from the forest into the clearing. It then rises with that low warm air, forms clouds, convectional thunder clouds, and then tends to rain over the clearing. So it dumps its rain over this clearing, and then the water tends to recycle back as dry air. So you get this cycle happening here. Moist air being stolen from the forest, being lost in the clearings, and then cycling back as dry air. So that, if that's happening, what might happen at a basin-wide scale, as we're losing forest and fragmenting forest, what we might actually expect is to get this initial increase in rainfall as we lose forest, as we disrupt forest. But then, and again, there's no real definitive proof for this, but this is the prevailing idea, we are likely to sort of fall off a cliff and get a dramatic collapse in rainfall as the system just can't keep up the hydrological demands anymore. So that's the idea. And so it's an interesting interaction between factors such as deforestation and fragmentation. And when you look at this and you try to map it, in fact, Susan Lawrence and her colleagues found that if you use MODIS imagery and you look at, in the Brazilian Amazon, you look at the rainforest area, you can actually detect this pattern of desiccation, of drying out of the forest canopy. And they looked at different study sites, but typical value would be on the order of about 3 kilometers. In other words, from about 3 kilometers from a cattle pasture or cropland into the rainforest, you're getting drying out, desiccation of the rainforest up to that distance. So really what it says is that this kind of thing can be creating a lot of complexity in rainfall, creating a lot of dynamics and changes in rainfall, and boy, oh boy, you don't get a rainforest without rainfall. you really do have to have the rainfall things under control. So anyway, it's an important synergism. And so just to summarize, the amount of local rainfall, it's not just a function of how much deforestation has happened, but also the spatial patterns of clearing in the surrounding landscape. And so this can introduce all kinds of variation, local and regional scale variation in rainforest ecosystems, above and beyond fragmentation effects. Now, a third one, again, I think this is kind of an obvious one, but there's a definite synergism between habitat fragmentation and fire in many areas of the tropics. And so what often will happen is that cattle ranchers, in places like the Amazon, cattle ranchers will burn their pastures often every year in order to control weeds and produce a flush of green grass for the cattle. And so you can see here, for instance, these fires burning through the pasture and then coming right up to the edge of the forest. The fires are always, virtually always done in the dry season. And then sometimes it comes up to the edge of that forest. And then what you can get is the fire penetrating right into the interior of the forest. And fire is an absolutely non-normal disturbance in tropical rainforests. Its effects on plant communities and animal communities really are quite striking. And what we can see here, this is looking at a bunch of habitat fragments in a place called Tailândia, Brazil. And this is the average value of over 14 different years and over, I think, about 1,000 different habitat fragments. But the bottom line is this. Here's the edge of the forest. This would be cattle pasture out here, typically. And then we get fires, not very many fires at all, deep into the forest, a few kilometers. But then as we get to within a couple kilometers of the edge, the fire frequency just rises, just spikes dramatically. So in other words, this fragmentation effect is really altering the ecology of the forest. And you see this when you drive around places in the Amazon. We call them ghost trees. You'll see this, a bunch of white skeletonized trees that have been killed by former fires. There might be a patch of forest in there hiding behind that, but its days are very limited because of this dynamic in many cases. And there's a lot of concern that this might, you probably heard about tipping points in the Amazon. There's a lot of concern about whether the Amazon might be driven into some sort of dry ecosystem with a fire-dominated ecosystem. And these kinds of regime shifts can definitely push a system like the Amazon that way. I don't think I'll say too much more about that. Okay, another synergism is what we might call ecosystem level drivers. This is some work that was done at the Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments project in the central Amazon. And one thing that happened there, we have a series of study plots in the intact forest. These are our so-called controls, our experimental controls. And then we have a series of plots within forest fragments ranging from 1 to 100 hectares in area. And as we were looking at the forest dynamics and changes in tree composition and vine composition and other things happening in these forests, this is an experiment that's been going on for 40 years, by the way. So it's been happening for a very long time. But as we did that, we saw that the controls, the plots that were in an intact forest and are supposed to just be not changing and just being normal or varying randomly, the controls weren't acting like controls at all. The controls were acting like something weird, and they were doing it. There wasn't just change happening. It wasn't like the controls were just moving all around. They were moving kind of in a concerted direction. So the question is, well, what's going on here? They're not fragmented. In our study area, there's no logging in that particular area. There's no hunting. So what's happening? Well, something was happening. So we've seen within our plots an increase over time in forest dynamics, like in the last decade. Forest dynamics have been increasing. We've seen species of plants like lianas, which, as you probably know, are disturbance-adapted vines, woody vines, that really like logged and disturbed forests. So they're increasing over time. And lianas also have an antagonistic effect with trees. They're the enemies of trees. They slow tree growth because they infest and parasitize the trees. They slow tree growth, they increase tree mortality, and they reduce tree fecundity. So nothing good really is happening to trees as a consequence of heavy liana infestations. And as a consequence, one of the things we see is that there's a negative relationship between tree biomass and lianas. In other words, places with lots of lianas don't have as many trees, especially as many big trees, and so they don't store as much carbon. And we rely on these forests for storing lots of carbon to keep our world a better place. So here's an example. After scratching our heads for quite a while and asking ourselves, like, why are we getting these concerted changes happening in intact forests? We kind of worked out that it probably is for lack of a better explanation, it's probably down to some kind of global change driver or possibly regional change driver. But I think the most plausible explanation is probably rising CO2 levels. Those are providing a fertilization effect for a lot of rainforest plants, and plants that tend to grow fast naturally, like lianas, are a group that tend to, in experiments, respond positively to rising levels of CO2. Well, of course, the lianas are increasing, but they're also disrupting the ecology of the forest, both the intact forest and the fragmented forest. So anyway, the bottom line is there's an environmental synergism in that case. And sometimes I have to say a little bit of a pet peeve. People talk a lot about climate change. Does that include changes in CO2? Okay, that includes changes in CO2, because to me, that's like something different, but oftentimes doesn't. Okay, because it should do, right. Okay, number 5, warming and pathogens. We all know about the chytrid fungus that's wiped out about 200 species of amphibians around the world today. 14 species in Australia were really devastated by this, all rainforest species, all stream-dwelling frogs. We did some work here in the late 1990s, and this is looking at populations of 4 species of frogs when at the time, we didn't know what it was. We just knew something bad was coming. Anyway, but we were monitoring these populations here, and you can see boom, 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 3 out of the 4 went completely extinct at these sites. Here's one that survived. But bottom line is this chytrid fungus was truly a devastating pathogen. Alan Pounds and colleagues studied harlequin frogs in South America. About 100 species of harlequin frogs tend to occur at high elevations. And they found that most of about 100 species have gone extinct. They're extinct, not just down, completely gone. And they found out that, or they discovered that that tended to happen in warmer years. We know that the pathogen, the chytrid fungus, is very sensitive to temperature. But still, when I read that, I don't know. There was something about the whole paper, the whole thing I didn't like. I decided to redo the analysis, and I was really pretty determined to show that Pounds and them were wrong, and we had data here in Australia. So we went and looked at temperature patterns around the timing of declines of frogs here in Eastern Australia. And lo and behold, we found significant support for Pounds' hypothesis, which I wasn't expecting at all. Now, it's only 0.045, but still, I have a certain leeriness about this. But the bottom line is these data seem to suggest that we could get an interaction between temperature variations associated with global warming and pathogen outbreaks for some kinds of pathogens. There could be other kinds of pathogens that are suppressed, but I think overall, most people would say the warm and often moist conditions that we would expect with global warming would tend to foster more pathogen outbreaks. And we know also that we're living in a world with lots of different kinds of emerging pathogens, and it's something that we ignore at our peril. Okay, the last synergism is just a label that sort of faunal declines. We know, we've already said this, but here's just an example. Most species, when they're out in nature, they're facing multiple environmental threats. It's not just one thing. They don't have to just worry about hunting. They've also maybe got to worry about habitat fragmentation, or they've also got to worry about logging activity. So this is some work that Carlos Perez, a Brazilian biologist, did in the Amazon. This is looking at about 150 forest fragments, and this is logging pressure. So none, low, medium, high, very high. And what you can see here is when looking at logging and looking at hunting, that the species in these fragmented habitats are very much being affected by other things. They're being affected by logging, they're being affected by hunting, probably other things as well. So it's just the fate, it's just the nature of the modern environmental crisis that we're confronting right now. Now, one of the things that we wanted to do is this. We wanted to ask on a larger scale, rather than just one study at a time, is there some kind of systematic way in which species that are facing combinations of threats might be more vulnerable than we would necessarily think. So what we did was, I'm not going to explain exactly how we did this. I'm happy to talk about it later. We looked at the IUCN Red database for mammals, for birds, and for reptiles and amphibians, and we calculated the expected proportion of species that would be expected to be imperiled by combinations of environmental threats. For instance, agriculture and hunting, or agriculture and urban sprawl, or sprawl and hunting, going down the list here. And we then, that gives us so we calculated the expected value. I can explain later. It's quite a simple way that we used to do that. And then the red bar here shows us what we actually found. The bottom line is this: there were many, many more species declining when they were facing environmental combinations, 2 or more threats, than we would expect just due to chance. It was off the charts, okay? Overwhelmingly powerful effect, okay? So, and it happened for all kinds of different combinations of threats. Not all of them, but many of them. Tells us again, I think that if we really want to understand extinction, we need to be thinking about studying how species respond to these interacting threats. And I've been talking a lot about the rainforests and about actually ended up quite a lot about the Amazon, but of course we also work in the Asia Pacific region and in Africa. But I also just wanted to mention that we're talking about one ecosystem there, of course, which is rainforest. But I would argue, I bet if you looked at the Great Barrier Reef, I'll bet if you looked at the Antarctic, I'll bet if you looked at savanna systems, I'll bet these kinds of phenomena are happening in many places. I would doubt very much if they're only being restricted to tropical rainforests. So 3 quick take-home messages. Environmental synergisms might be the norm in nature. We maybe need to recalibrate our thinking to say, look, we're oversimplifying things if we're going out and trying to address single environmental effects. Synergistic drivers can greatly complicate efforts to predict human activities because, of course, when you're getting multiple drivers interacting, that can create all kinds of spatial and temporal complications and really can make it quite difficult to predict what's going to happen in future. But I think an awareness of these synergisms very much dictates a need for what's been called the precautionary principle, and that is this: when we're not sure in any kind of environmental context, when we're just not sure, and in many cases that is the case, we should err on the side of being careful, of being cautious, of not taking chances. And I think in many ways that psychology hasn't penetrated deeply enough. We need it to penetrate into the public, and we need these ideas about environmental synergisms and combinations of threats to penetrate much more widely into the general public. Thank you.